Let's talk about why overwhelm can make you shut down. Because sometimes when life feels like too much, you don't fall apart in obvious ways. You just go blank, or feel stuck, or feel like you've got nothing left to give. If you've ever wondered why you suddenly can't think straight or do things that would normally be manageable, it may be functional freeze, a shutdown response to overwhelm that gets worse if you just treat it like a motivation problem. In this episode, I'm talking about why it happens and how to deal with it. So let's talk about the freeze response. Hello, I'm Jeremy Godwin, and this is the Let's Talk About Mental Health podcast, full of practical tools for better mental health. Today we're talking about why overwhelm can sometimes lead to shutdown, and we're going to discuss what functional freeze is, as well as why it affects your mental health if you leave it unaddressed, and what you can do when your nervous system feels like it's hit a wall. Because this is one of those experiences that can be incredibly frustrating if you don't have the language for it. You know that something's off, you might feel mentally foggy or emotionally numb, or like even basic things suddenly are harder to do than they should be. And from the outside, it may not even look like you're struggling all that much. You might still be going to work, replying to messages, paying the bills, doing all the things. But underneath all of that, it can feel like you're dragging yourself through wet cement. And what makes this stuff even harder is that a lot of the time we respond to it by putting more pressure on ourselves. We tell ourselves to get it together, push through, stop wasting time. But if what's actually happening is that your capacity has been overloaded, then that kind of pressure usually just makes things worse. Because this is not only about what you're capable of in theory, it's also about what you have the capacity for in practice, in reality, in this moment, with everything your mind and your body are already having to deal with. So the first thing I want you to remember is this. When you shut down, the goal isn't to force yourself back into full speed. It's to reduce the pressure first. Because when your system is overloaded, more pressure usually doesn't create momentum. It creates more resistance. It makes your brain noisier and your body more tense. And it makes everything feel even more impossible. So instead of asking yourself, well, how do I make myself get on with this? Ask yourself instead, what would lower the pressure on me in this moment, even just a little bit? That might mean stepping away from something for 5 minutes, or doing one very small task instead of trying to tackle 10. Or it could be delaying a non-urgent decision, or simply admitting to yourself that you're overloaded instead of pretending that you're fine. So remember this, reduce pressure before you expect performance. And we're going to build on that even more later, because once you understand what shutdown is actually doing, that's when it becomes much easier to respond to it in a way that helps you instead of hurts you. So with that in mind, let's dig a bit deeper and let's talk about what is functional freeze and shutdown. So functional freeze is when your stress response shifts into shutdown mode, but not necessarily in a way that looks dramatic from the outside. You might still be getting through the day, still showing up and smiling and doing whatever needs to be done, but underneath all of that, your system is overloaded. You feel foggy, flat, disconnected, stuck, or like everything is taking 10 times more effort than it should. And that's why I use the word functional here, because in many cases when it comes to functional freeze, you're still technically functioning. You're not completely collapsed on the floor, unable to move. You're doing life, or at least the absolute minimum required version of it, but it feels heavy and hard, and maybe even strangely distant, like your brain and body have quietly pulled the handbrake, and now everything requires way more effort. This is part of the freeze response, which sits alongside the better known fight or flight response, which you've probably heard of before. So when your system reads something as being too much, whether it's too much stress, too much pressure, too much emotion, too much uncertainty, too much for too long, that's when your system can respond by slowing you down, numbing you out, or making it harder to think clearly and take action. It's overwhelm in action. It's not because you suddenly don't care, or because you're not capable, or because there's something wrong with you, but it's because your system is trying to protect you by conserving emotional energy and maybe even physical energy, and by reducing exposure. And this is where a lot of people often get confused, because when we think about stress, we tend to imagine obvious panic and anxiety, right? And reactivity, agitation, or feeling highly emotional. But overwhelm doesn't always look like that. Sometimes it looks like staring at the same task for an hour and getting absolutely nowhere. Sometimes it looks like canceling things because you just cannot face one more demand. And sometimes it looks like going quiet, zoning out, or feeling like your brain has just left the building. So, in very plain language, functional freeze is what can happen when overwhelm takes over. Your capability may still be there, but your access to it is significantly reduced because your system is overloaded. And so you just do not have the capacity. And if you don't understand that basic mechanism, it can be really easy to misread what's happening and then start attacking yourself and blaming yourself for a problem that actually needs a very different kind of response. Because the way that it impacts your well-being is huge. So, on that note, now let's talk about why shutdown affects your mental health so much. And the piece here is that this is not just about fixing things by maybe being a bit quiet for a while or having a little rest. When shutdown becomes a pattern, it can start messing with the way you think, feel, cope, and function. It can leave you feeling disconnected from yourself, cut off from other people, and frustrated by the fact that things that should feel manageable suddenly don't. And when that keeps happening, it can chip away at your confidence pretty quickly. One of the toughest parts of all of this is that shutdown often creates a really confusing gap between what you know you're capable of and what you can actually access in the moment. You know how to do the thing. You know what needs to happen. You may even want to do it. But your system is so overloaded that there's a disconnect between intention and action. And if you don't recognize that, it becomes very easy to start telling yourself a story that becomes self-critical, right? Things like, what's wrong with me? Or why can't I just get on with it? And that's what has a really big impact on your mental health. Because the more often you judge yourself and misread shutdown as being failure or weakness or a lack of discipline or willpower, the more pressure and shame you're going to be adding to a system that's already under strain. And shame is not a great regulator. It's not a great friend. It does not create clarity or safety or momentum. Usually what shame does is it makes you feel worse about yourself. It makes you feel more weak, more stuck, and more exhausted. There's also the fact that shutdown can quietly shrink your life. You end up putting things off, you withdraw, you avoid conversations, decisions, responsibilities, and you do all of that because everything just feels like it's too much. You stop trusting yourself. And over time, all of that can feed anxiety, low mood, resentment, guilt, and a really, really toxic sense that you're supposedly not coping, even though what's actually happening is that you've been overloaded for too long without enough recovery, support, or change. And so this is the deeper point that I really want to make here. Shutdown is often what happens when your capacity and your demands are out of alignment for too long. So yes, there may be shame in it, and yes, there may be fear or self-judgment in it. But underneath all of that is a much more practical truth. Something about the way you're living, coping, carrying things, avoiding things, or just pushing through is no longer sustainable. In other words, this is not just about how well you cope. It's about whether or not your current load still fits your actual capacity. That's the real message here in this episode. The problem is not always that you're incapable. In fact, I'd say it's rarely that you're incapable. The problem is often that you are trying to keep operating at full capacity when your system has already been telling you loud and clear that something has to change. When your system is overloaded, something needs to give. Because nothing changes if nothing changes. And if you ignore that fact for too long, it's your mental health that usually pays the price. Because when you keep trying to override what your mind and body are telling you, you don't just stay overwhelmed, you become more disconnected from yourself. And once that disconnection sets in, it becomes so much harder to know what you need, to ask for what you need, or to do what would actually help you. So how do you work through all of that? How do you push forward? Well, that's exactly what we're about to discuss right after this quick break. And welcome back. So now let's get into my favorite part, the how-to part of this episode, and let's talk about how to deal with the freeze response. Now let's dig into what to do when your system is overloaded. And here's how I want to break this down. First, I'm going to give you some things that you can do in the moment when shutdown is happening, because that's about reducing pressure and helping your system to feel safer. Then I'll give you some things to do over the next couple of weeks to start recovering capacity, because if you only focus on the moment itself and ignore what led up to it, you're probably just going to end up back there again. And then I'll finish off with some longer-term, bigger picture shifts to work on that are going to help you to reduce the chances of this becoming your default way of coping. Now, it is a lot of ground to cover. And as always, everything I share here can be found in the transcript at ltamh.com/episodes, and that transcript is linked in the description. So you don't need to remember every single word I say here. The point is to identify what potentially works for you and then create a plan for yourself that's going to focus on putting it into practice one step at a time. All right. So with all of that said, now let's begin with the in-the-moment stuff. And my first suggestion is reduce the pressure. The first thing to do when you're shutting down is to reduce the pressure immediately. And yes, I know that sounds almost too simplistic, but this is where a lot of people get it wrong because they notice that they feel stuck or flat or foggy or frozen, whatever, and they respond by trying to force themselves harder, piling on more urgency, having more self-criticism, more unrealistic expectations, and then they wonder why nothing improves. But if your system is overloaded, pressure is usually a big part of the problem, and it's definitely not the solution. So the first question here is not, how do I get everything done? It's, what can I delay, simplify, remove, or lower right now? Sometimes that means doing one tiny task instead of the 50 that are on your to-do list. Sometimes it means sending the message later, not now. Sometimes it's admitting honestly that today is not the day for a big decision. This is not about giving up or giving in. It's about stopping the spiral from getting worse. Okay, next, ground your system. Now, the piece here is to focus on stabilizing your system and grounding yourself, and not just your thoughts, because shutdown is not only mental, it's physical as well. Your body is a big part of this. So you need something that helps you to come back into the present in a way that feels realistic and doable. So that might be standing up and stretching, or washing your hands in warm water, or stepping outside for a few minutes. Maybe it's unclenching your jaw a few times, or putting both feet firmly on the floor and taking 3 or 4 deep and slow breaths. Pick what's right for you. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or dramatic, just something that tells your system very clearly, we are present and we are safe enough in this moment. And that really matters because a lot of us hear the idea of nervous system advice and think, ugh, we need some perfect wellness routine. And if you look on Instagram, a lot of people are trading on that idea. When really in moments like this, no, you just need a small physical signal that lowers the emotional intensity a bit. Small shifts create real momentum. Next, make the next step smaller than your pride wants it to be. When you're overloaded, the brain often looks at the full size and scope of everything and tries to fix everything, and then it realizes, no, absolutely not. I don't have the capacity. So stop asking yourself to complete the whole task or resolve the whole issue. Ask for the smallest useful piece of movement. Open the document. Wash 1 plate. Reply to 1 message. You are not trying to impress anyone here. You're trying to re-establish movement without triggering more resistance and shutdown. And this is where being honest with yourself really, really matters. If your system has shut down, then expecting peak performance from yourself is, sorry to say it, ridiculous. It's also cruel. What you need in this moment is self-compassion, not self-judgment. The real work here is to lower the threshold enough so that action becomes possible again. Okay, so now let's talk through some things to focus on over the next few weeks so that you can recover your capacity instead of just waiting to feel better. First, consider why shutdown is happening. After you've had a freeze response or gone into shutdown mode for a while, it can be really easy to think, I'll just rest for a bit and then I'll bounce back. And sure, sometimes you will. But if freeze and shutdown keep on happening, then you need to look at things more closely and try to identify and understand what kind of pressure your system has been carrying. That requires an honest conversation with yourself. Have you been dealing with stress for too long? Have you been saying yes too often when you mean to say no? Have you been trying to function at a level that your body and mind cannot currently sustain? Have you been overloaded emotionally, socially, mentally, or practically? Look, don't go and overanalyze every single action, every single mood shift, but please take a step back and just get curious about what is the pattern here that's emerging. Are you dealing with too many demands in a short period of time? Is there conflict, uncertainty, overstimulation? Do you have too much emotional labor? Do you have too little sleep? Too much of pretending that you're fine when you're not? Functional freeze doesn't usually just magically come out of nowhere. It's a response to something, and there's often a build-up. And so the more clearly that you can identify your own pattern, the easier it's going to become to intervene earlier next time. Prevention is better than cure. So if you're able to identify those things, you can start to recognize the signs before you get to shutdown. This is one of the most practical things that you can do for your mental health, which is to learn your own warning signs before you hit the wall. So really what I'm talking about here is that this is the part where you stop treating the shutdown as being the entire issue and really, really look at what's going on underneath it. Shutdown is simply a symptom. It is not the cause. So when you look underneath it, that's when you can begin to identify and address the cause, because nothing changes if nothing changes. And on that note, my next point is protect your limits. And this is one of the most important changes to make, and it's especially important if your capability and your capacity are currently out of sync. Because this is where a lot of us get ourselves into trouble, right? We might say, but I can do it. And maybe you can, technically. But that's not the way to look at this. The better approach, the healthier approach, is to ask yourself, can I do this without draining myself even further? Capability is about whether something is possible. Capacity is about whether or not it is sustainable. And those two things are not always the same. Stop focusing all of your energy on your capability and focus your energy on your capacity. The distinction between the two is really important when you're overwhelmed, because a lot of shutdown comes from repeatedly operating beyond your capacity, beyond what is actually sustainable, and then being surprised when your system eventually slams on the brakes, which it will. All right, so now we're going to talk through longer term things for you to work on over the coming months. My first recommendation is build a more honest relationship with your limits, which is just a nice and professional way for me to say, for the love of puppies, know what your limits are and stop pushing yourself beyond them to the point of overwhelm. Now, to be clear, this is absolutely not the same thing as becoming fearful or fragile or avoidant, right? It just means being truthful about what your mind and body can realistically carry and making decisions that respect that. Some of you are no doubt very good at functioning right up to the point where you can't. That's great, but, you keep going, you keep showing up, you keep holding it together, and then you wonder why you end up feeling blank, flat, or just completely spent. Stop pushing yourself to that level. That isn't what strength and resilience is supposed to be about. Strength that costs you your peace is just a more socially acceptable form of self-abandonment. Show yourself the love and kindness that you need, that you deserve, by treating yourself with respect. And if that's something that you often struggle with, check out episode 326 about being kinder to yourself. It's linked in the description. Okay, next, stop treating pressure as normal. For a lot of people, overload has become so familiar that it barely registers anymore. You're probably used to being stretched too thin, to carrying too much, to going about your day with a constant background hum of tension, urgency, and non-stop emotional labor. And when all of that becomes normalized, shutdown can end up being one of the only ways that your system can get your attention. It's your body and your mind telling you the truth before your mind is ready to hear it. So listen to what it's saying and take it seriously, because it's telling you loud and clear that something has to change. Which leads to my next point: make changes in your life. We can sit here and chat about this and intellectualize this stuff all we like and talk about why it happens, but at some point the rubber has to hit the road. Action needs to replace words. If you want change, you need to create change, even if that means taking just one small step at a time. That might mean changing how much you commit to, setting firmer boundaries with your time, building in proper recovery time and protecting it instead of treating rest as being something that you only earn once you've already passed out on the floor. Not healthy. It might mean getting support, having harder conversations, or finally admitting that something in your life needs to change. Not in a dramatic burn it all to the ground kind of way, but in a practical, adult, honest with yourself way. Because staying in the same pattern and hoping that your shutdown will just magically stop is not a strategy. It's just avoidance in nicer clothes. So if you are struggling, do something about it. Make changes. If you're not sure how to do that, get support. Work with a counselor or therapist who can help you to identify options and who can help you to navigate the way forward. So, here's what I want you to take away from this episode. If overwhelm keeps making you shut down, that doesn't automatically mean that you're incapable. Very often it means that your system is overloaded. It means that your capacity has been stretched way too far. And it means that something about the way that you're living or coping or carrying pressure has to change. So ask yourself this: Where in your life are you still expecting full performance from yourself when your system is already telling you that it needs something different? Let me know in the comments and let's talk about it. Because when you boil it all down, shutdown is a clear sign that something has to change. Each week I like to finish up by sharing a quote about the topic, and I encourage you to take a few moments to really reflect on it and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is, "Overwhelm only wins if you let it." Let me repeat that. Overwhelm only wins if you let it. All right, that's it for this week. For more straightforward tips, grab a copy of my book, Life Advice That Doesn't Suck. It's linked in the description. If you'd like to support my work, you can find out more about my Patreon at ltamh.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please leave a rating or review on your favorite platform because it helps more people discover the show. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time. Join me next week when I talk about navigating anxiety and exhaustion. And check out my episode on emotional regulation next. It's linked in the description. I release new episodes every Sunday, so follow or subscribe to never miss an episode. Let's Talk About Mental Health is an independent program. Discover more at ltamh.com.